My name is Rebecca Lemon, and I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities here at the University of Southern California. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation about Natania Meeker's wonderful book, Illusive Materialisms, The Pleasures of Femininity in 18th-Century France, which just appeared with Fordham University Press in 2026. We do invite everyone who is able to please, if possible, turn on your cameras. It's a nicer occasion if we can see the faces of colleagues and friends, and I think it will help Natania to feel kind of as welcomed and feted as possible. Joining us today are commentators Andrew Clark, who is professor of French and comparative literature at Fordham University, and Jessie Hock, who is associate professor of English at Vanderbilt University. The conversation will be moderated by our own colleague Neetu Khanna, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Gender and Sexuality Studies here at USC. Today's conversation was organized in partnership with the Department of French and Italian, the Department of Comparative Studies in Literature and Culture, and the department, or the program really, and the Department of Comparative Literature. It was also organized in large part by the Levan Associate Director, Zach Mann. So I'd just like to give him a big shout out. Thank you, Zach. Our program today will start with a very short introduction to the book by Natania. She will then be in conversation with Professors Clark and Hock for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. And at that time, Professor Khanna will open the floor to questions from everyone. You will be able to ask questions by raising your Zoom hand. You can put something in the chat. If you've forgotten how to raise your Zoom hand, you can just kind of wave your hand around wildly. And I will just say, one thing that I've noticed over the course of kind of what can become a captivating conversation between the author and the two guest interlocutors, the audience can take a kind of passive role due to the dazzling nature of the conversation. So I do encourage you to formulate your questions as you hear Natania, Andrew, and Jessie converse, so that then you can be ready for a little bit more of an active role when Neetu opens the floor to all of us. So Natania, many congratulations again on your wonderful book. Please tell us about it.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Rebecca. And I just have a few remarks. One of the arguments of this book is that the pleasures that emerge from vicissitude, which is to say all pleasures, are made rather than taken, and they are made in concert and in community across time and place. And with this in mind, I want to thank not only the Levan Institute and the Departments of French and Italian and Comparative Literature and the program in Comparative Studies in Literature and Culture, for their sponsorship and support of this event, but also the many people who have shaped the book and its expression of a set of practices or experiences that always involve the labors and pleasures of others. I'm so grateful to all of you, and I know the book would not exist without you. I especially want to thank Professors Andrew Clark, Jessie Hock, and Neetu Khanna, who have agreed to serve as discussants today, and Professor Rebecca Lemon and Dr. Zachary Mann for their generous support of the event. I'm really honored by this occasion and opportunity. And I'm also deeply appreciative of the kindness of students, graduate and undergraduate, who gave me so many signs of their care and enthusiasm over the years. The fact that this book spoke to you in particular as a new generation of readers and thinkers who will shape what it is possible to know and imagine is extremely meaningful to me. The book emerged as a kind of sequel to my first, which also took up the question of materialism, its commitment to the cultivation of pleasure and pleasurable techniques, and its investment in poetics. As I wrote this first monograph, I noticed the persistence within strands of materialist philosophy of tropes, concepts, and experiences that invoked femininity, even in the absence of women as explicit participants in the debates that I was studying. I wanted to explore this persistence. But the process of writing Illusive Materialisms was also interrupted, albeit in a most galvanizing way, by an experience of co-authorship with my colleague Antonia Sabari that moved me away from the specific questions of 18th century materialist thought and into a more transhistorical and ecological direction. This experience changed my relationship both to my idea of what materialism might mean to its adherents and to my own practice as a writer. I came to understand the latter as excitingly capacious and open, but also very fundamentally not my own. Instead, the result of a whole series of conjunctions taking place in ways that I could not always consciously account for, even though they lie latent within my work, like the traces of forgotten sensations that Diderot invokes in the Éléments de physiologie. So while this book has an explicitly 18th century orientation and is not directly concerned with environmental questions, it nonetheless takes up a key issue present in my collaborative ecological work, namely the question of how to write, act, and think in full recognition of the vulnerability of all forms of life to disaster. This question, how to make delight out of constraint, how to find enjoyment in catastrophe, has been one that has interested materialist philosophers since antiquity. In Epicurean contexts, I argue, the answer to it passes through the ascription of a feminine softness, sweetness, and malleability to all bodies, a quality that might either be excavated or cultivated from within them. As I try to show in the book, the 18th century witnesses a renewed interest on the part of specific philosophers in femininity as a universal attribute of matter and feminine subjectivity as an especially generative form. In conversation with, and indeed part of this development, are a set of feminine persons who live with this form, both in its artificiality and in its substance, at one and the same time. These persons I've named Illusive Materialisms and this materialists, and this in two senses. On the one hand, they don't really appear to be materialists at all. They're generally not named in that way, even as they engage with materialist texts, ask materialist questions, and respond, revise, and reshape materialist ideas. On the other hand, they take illusion seriously as a materialist force, in this way taking up a strand of ancient reflections on the means by which pleasure makes its way to and through bodies, means that are never simply given to us, but must be managed, deployed, and wrested out of the situations of constraint that we inhabit. Writing and reading are part of this effort. Centrally, Illusive Materialisms attempts to understand how three women, Madeleine de Puisieux, Émilie du Châtelet, and Françoise de Graffigny, turn to materialisms in order to think about femininity, their own and others, as a materialist practice and a form of pleasure-giving technique. But it also analyzes how authors more readily associated with the rise of 18th century materialist thought, including Denis Diderot, Julien Offray de la Métrie, and Claude Adrien Helvétius, embrace feminine subjectivity for their own ends. It is thus a two-pronged project, but I do not intend it to be dimorphic. The priority here is the presentation of an illusive materialism that reworks the experience of femininity as a specific situation in which all sorts of bodies participate, not an origin point or an essence. I'm almost done. Puisieux, du Châtelet, and Graffigny conjugate critique with imaginative creation, despair with a crafty negotiation of the constraints that make their pleasures visible and legible. And they activate materialist themes in order to articulate their own distinctive mode of practice, one based in the artful cultivation of illusion, as well as in the recognition of a collective human fragility. Their materialisms emerge from a double deception. They hide in plain sight, avoiding identification with a doctrine and prioritizing illusion-generating techniques. Through my reading of these women's work, I try to make the case throughout the book for a reanimation of materialist legacies and questions that allows for a rethinking of femininity as an embodied but also conceptually enriched situation that prioritizes literary and poetic modes of inquiry and that regularly turns to artifice and art making as a means of providing an opening within a confined or even desolate life. In short, I prioritize the question of pleasure in the feminine, which is perhaps different from that of women's pleasure, as a key to a legacy of materialist inquiry. And I'm very excited and a little nervous to discuss the book with you.
Great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I think in our little breakout room, we decided that Jessie would begin with the process of maybe comment or a question or two. So, Jessie, I hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very excited to talk about this book, which I think is really important and field shifting. I am an early modernist by trade, working on classical reception history and materialism. So I tend to think about these issues in the 16th and then early 17th century. And it's very interesting to see how things get torqued and reformulated as they move later. But the first thing I'll say is really just to highlight what I take to be the really crucial aspects of this book, which should be understood also as meaning the portable ones to different centuries, to all different periods. And the first one is really obvious, and yet somehow not in the scholarly tradition, which is um, femininity is so outrageously important to the tradition of philosophical materialism from its inception through the 21st century. And yet it is, to my mind, woefully understudied. By and large, you will have, discussions of, oh, Epicurus is sort of flamed for being girly or, having a soft philosophy. You've Pamela Gordon's great book, but as a sort of philosophical corner is a cornerstone of the philosophy. It's actually a part of the content of philosophical materialism. It tends to not get enough playing time. So basically, just say it would be difficult to overstate how on point this book is in emphasizing the importance of gender and femininity, particularly to the materialist tradition. And the other thing, Tanya talked about all of these, so I'm sort of just highlighting them, is the way that you get a hold of the importance of gender or femininity in the materialist tradition is if you are willing to abandon dogma. You have to be willing to abandon dogma. And this is another thing that has been very, very difficult sort of for scholars to do for quite obvious reasons, one of which is we tend to think about philosophy in terms of dogma. There's idealism, there's materialism. We think of legacies, we think of these kind of broad currents. And moreover, philosophical materialism has often been, at least in early modernity and forwards, has been highly contentious as a set of dogmas. So do you believe in this? Okay, you're in trouble, right? Um, and moreover, the sort of ideas that are taken to be central to philosophical materialism are often something like mechanism and secularism. At least that's how people, or enlightenment. But this is one of the things that's really interestingly different about the 18th century. So the move to say that we can't only include people in this canon who have said, I am a materialist, that's a really, really important methodological move that opens up the field in an enormous quantity of ways. I also feel like I'm probably not supposed to talk for that long, right? Am I supposed to stop now, Rebecca? It was supposed to be brief at
You're
the beginning.
you're doing just fine.
I wasn't sure. Um, so those are incredibly important, like broad moves that I think if we can keep doing that, around these figures in this century and other centuries, there are just enormous sort of new discoveries that we can make, basically. So one thing that I really love about this book is just the way that it, for me at least, was I was going to say liberating, but that's a loaded term in this context. But sort of was an invitation to do much more work in really interesting ways, and I really appreciate that. And the last thing I'll say is just, there are also really cornerstone moves that Natania makes, such as, what is pleasure, right? What even is materialism? And again, this can look maybe less momentous from within an 18th century perspective, the idea that what materialism is pleasure. But I can tell you that although there is a caricatured version of ancient materialism or materialist philosophy that sees it as hedonism, there's also a way, at least in early modern scholarship, that if you say materialist, again, people say that means mechanist and that means secularist. Pleasure gets excised completely. Pleasure is like the insult term that you use to derogate materialists. It's not actually at the heart of the philosophy. So another thing for me coming from the sort of time period scholarship that I do, just thinking about this big question of like materialism is pleasure. Like how do we define the contours of this? How do we think about the ways that a philosophy how much our understanding of like the core of a philosophy shifts from century to century, and how we can think about being rigorous and yet open in those definitions. So that's something I'd want to talk about more. But all in all, this is just a very exciting work, and thank you.
That's wonderful. And so, Andrew, I don't know if you want to jump in here, or Natania, if you want to respond, and either one is fine. And then I'll take a back seat.
Whatever
Yeah,
Natanya
sure.
prefers.
Yeah.
I
Maybe
mean,
Andrew,
yeah, I
we'll
mean,
see.
I can make a few brief comments, and I agree with everything that Jesse said so beautifully. So, first of all, thank you, Natanya. Thank you, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be here and speak about this absolutely fantastic book. It's an imaginative book in so many different ways, and it's going to, I think, um, significantly rethink a number of writers in the 18th century, and particularly how we think about materialism in the 18th century. And I think that materialism is rather plural in the 18th century. I think there are very different types of materialism. I have my own prejudices as a kind of Diderot scholar. Um, I always kind of felt La Mettrie and Helvetius were more on the mechanical sides of things in my own kind of interpretations of 18th century materialism, and probably would class Diderot more with an illusive materialism after Natania's book in a certain way. I'll give a very I thought this was supposed to give a kind of overview, so I wrote out something not too sophisticated, but maybe it will help some of the readers. I mean, some of the audience members. So, Illusive Materialisms re-examines the intellectual landscape of the French Enlightenment by centering the concepts of sensual pleasure and femininity within materialist philosophy. Traditionally, and even in Meeker's previous book, Voluptuous Philosophy, 18th century French materialism has been viewed through the radical philosophical treatises of male thinkers. Meeker argues here, however, that pleasure, historically framed as a distinctly feminine mode of receptivity and penetrability, becomes an ethical and poetic practice that allows the women she studies, and she's named them, so I won't name them again, not only to pose vital philosophical questions about the nature of being, but also to reconfigure materialist philosophy itself through the use of illusion, artifice, the recognition of constraint, and intertextuality. The book argues that femininity during this area was not merely a biological or social category, but a kind of privileged condition of a different form of an enlightened subject. I was going to say modern, but I feel that's too loaded and too different from what I think she's actually more imaginatively seeking here. By foregrounding responses from her three women writers, Meeker demonstrates how they actively engage in reusing, revising, reworking materialist ideas to navigate their lives and the severe social limitations placed on them, and craft an ethic of pleasure. As such, she also calls us to imagine a feminine counter-enlightenment, one that, quote, imagines a community of feminine persons actively remaking the effective, imaginative, and eventually political possibilities available to them through the work and pleasures of writing, research, and conversation, end quote. Um, so, the work, as I think Jesse has said, is in broad conversation. It reaches way back to Epicurean and Lucretian philosophy. It intersects with 18th century libertine thought as well as materialist philosophy. And then it speaks and moves forward to 20th century queer studies and feminist experimental avant-garde poetry. Um, so while the book focuses primarily on writers in the second half of the 18th century, each of the women studied imaginatively sees their fulfillment, or the fulfillment of their philosophical practice and quest only in posterity. And I think this is a kind of interesting aspect of this text and the way in which there's a kind of provisional quality to the philosophy in that in many ways it can never be fully erected or completed in the moment, and has to speak to this other time period, often in the future, in order to potentially be realized. So I think Natania talks very interesting about Chatelet's her book on happiness as being finding a reader at some point in the future. And then I think one can think maybe about Asa in Graffigny's famous Lettres du Pruvienne as this kind of lover who theoretically exists but doesn't really exist as she reimagines him, but might be the lover that could enable her to think and have that kind of reciprocity that she imagines. So I'll leave it there.
Should I respond? Okay.
You get to decide where the conversation goes now. You get to pick, I think.
I don't.
I don't know, but I'm just making up the rules.
Okay. I really appreciate both of your remarks or all of your remarks from both of you. And one of the amazing things about having the privilege of writing a book is to see it kind of reanimated in the thought of others, and that's perhaps my absolute favorite thing about the privilege of writing a book. So thank you so much for that incredibly gracious and generous reanimation and rearticulation of the themes and the concerns. And I think you've both captured better than I can do in a way the questions that were crucial to me as I wrote and as I continue to think with these authors, all of whom have sort of accompanied me, or I feel like they've accompanied me for a long time. And my relationship to them has changed over time as I try to articulate in the book. But also my relationship to the question of pleasure as a libertine concept, but also as a set of experiences has really changed. And I feel as if one thing that is happening in the work of Puisieux, du Châtelet, and Graffigny is a kind of reactivation of Lucretius in particular as a philosopher who enables a different kind of relationship to embodiment itself as a set of practices. So in the Lucretian poem, pleasure is not an origin point or a kind of the beginning of a body, as it were, but it's something that emerges in the encounter between poet and reader, and also in the encounter with materialist thought, which admittedly has its deeply dogmatic aspects. So this is not a tradition without dogma. But I think what you see in Du Châtelet, Puisieux, and Graffigny is an attempt to kind of put this encounter with the materialist text, but also the materialist interlocutor to work in order to generate enjoyment, yes, but also to think through with and around the constraints that bring them into being effectively. So I guess it's important to me not to see sort of the turn to pleasure as a turn to a liberation that was always waiting. And I liked, Jessie, the way you kind of had a moment of hesitation around kind of the liberating. So in that sense, liberation is not a return, but something that is articulated through a set of encounters, through a set of relations, and within a set of gestures that morph over time. Anyway, I don't know if that's a good response or not, but I very much appreciate both of your kind of takes on the work and what it might be able to do.
So I have a question, which I have a lot of questions, but I have a question, and I'm gonna sort of take up the role of like the early modernist who's like, well, this happens in my period. Why doesn't it happen in yours? So sorry for that, but one of the things it's so funny. It's such a bizarre experience actually to read the book of somebody like I feel like we're very much on the same wavelength. I read what you're doing, and I'm like, yeah, she gets it. Like this is absolute like this is what I think. Why doesn't anybody else think what I think? So there's a profound feeling of recognition for me personally. But then there's also this real sense of distance where I almost am like I need to learn everything about the 18th century. It's as if there's this sort of radical shift where, yeah, all of a sudden materialism is pleasure and it's not this other thing. And there's so much I don't know about that. So this is by way of saying I need like a syllabus from you about how I learned the 18th century so as not to mess it up. So I guess the initial question, and I do have a follow-up, or I have another one which I can save, is just how do you think about just sort of the movement into this period that you're getting at? Like how do you see this thought arriving at this place, which is another way of saying what happens between, 1600 and 1700, or how do you understand this as like a flow or a transition or like a glimpse into one moment and a long reception, and how do you think about that or talk about that?
Thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. And I'll try to answer it. Maybe not comprehensively, but I think I see two things going on in these authors. On the one hand, there's a kind of I hesitate around this word, but there is a kind of radicalization of materialist philosophy that's happening. You could see 1748 as a kind of hinge point, and the emergence. The part of this radicalization is the emergence of this philosophy into not a fully public. I'm not like claiming at all that it's fully public, but it acquires a prominence. It acquires a certain kind of visibility, a kind of critical density, even and mass that maybe is not fully new, but is intensifying at this time. So that I see that happening. On the other hand, what I also see in the work of like Pleasures, Femininity, and Châtelet is, and I'm not the first person to notice this by any means, is a kind of calling back to the 17th century. Often there are kind of oblique references to the Précieuses, and an attempt to kind of think about the relationship of women and feminine persons to a literary history, and an attempt to think about the relation between literature, I'm sorry, among literature, poetry, pleasure, and the kind of cultivation of a gendered subjectivity. And so Prizier actually very like self-consciously kind of has these moments where she's calling back to an uh, earlier epoch, which witnessed the sort of rise of women authors, which the 18th century is over time, I think, gradually kind of facing in various interesting and complicated ways. There are debates around that, but I do see that sort of. It's not quite a nostalgia, but it's the attempt to sort of activate a different past. And you see that in Ninon de L'Enclos as well, who goes back, I'm sorry, Olympe de Gouges, who goes back to Ninon de L'Enclos and says, okay, let's think about Ninon de L'Enclos as a kind of ancestor, a materialist feminine ancestor who can like enable me to craft this public persona as an author. So I see those two strands as things that are, again, maybe not fully new, but developments that are happening within the 18th century. And they're linked up to like the rise of libertine naturalism. That is a key, component of the kind of cultural shifts and the preoccupation with femininity, which is by no means like exclusive to any of these authors, but is a fully kind of, you know, it cuts across diverse dimensions of culture. Femininity is a sign of political, social, and indeed racial and sexual decadence. And so all of these authors are in conversation with that, like much broader move too. And I think Jean has talked about that as sort of that emerges toward the end of the 17th century, but takes on greater force as the century moves along.
Thank you.
Maybe I could follow up on that a little bit in terms of the question of illusion. I think one of the most fascinating things about this book is the kind of counterintuitive way in which illusion works in the materialist philosophy of these different women. Because in many texts of certainly male materialist philosophy, illusion is something to that materialism is going to destroy or to unveil or to damper in some form. Um, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which that look back to the 17th century is. I mean, I think you show extremely convincingly, and for people who haven't read the book, the ways in which each of these authors are intersecting with Lucretius and intersecting with the materialist circles. It's not a book in which, Natania has kind of sensed certain types of Lucretian themes and just identified them. These are ongoing conversations. These are people who are citing and even manipulating different aspects of Lucretius' texts and other texts to engage with this philosophy in really important and interesting ways. But the question of illusion, I mean, many, many times in this text, I kept on going back to the Places de Clèves, and I kept on going back to the pavilion scene in particular in the Places de Clèves when the princess is staring at her, her portrait of Nemours and playing with her cane and her ribbons and stuff like that. And for me, it's this interesting moment because it's clearly a moment where she chooses to take an image and the illusion of Nemours as being much more powerful and as one that she could receive pleasure from, significant, both physical and imaginative and other forms of pleasure, in a way that his actual physical presence and actual physical person could never provide. And so I'm wondering how much of this need, because I think you show convincingly that Puisieux, Du Châtelet, and Graffigny each have to move to artifice, have to embrace illusion as a way of cultivating pleasure in a way that in an immediacy would not take place. How much of that do you think is gesturing back to 17th century writers like Lafayette and others in the way they're conceiving of illusion?
Well, thank you so much for that great question. And I'm excited for your book, which will take on the problem of the portrait in uh, with brilliance and care. And I know we'll answer this question, your own question, perhaps more directly. I do think the image, the problem of the image, is a very important one. And I do think that you find that question of how the image might function vis-a-vis a set of desires and maybe demands at different moments within literary history, in particular French literary history specifically, but also in antiquity. So the Heroid, for instance, is really a genre that I think all of these women are arguably invested in rewriting. And I could see Lafayette. I'd have to, I'm not a scholar of Lafayette, but I could see Lafayette engaged with a similar set of questions. I guess what was motivating to me is, the image is so often used as a kind of articulation of objectification, right? Like it's the moment when the objectification is frozen and made available. You see this in traditions of libertine, writing and art. And there's a kind of, the image is transmissible, it's portable in different ways, and it's often positioned as compensatory. I guess one of the things that these women do, which is interesting to me, and and we could maybe have a conversation about whether Lafayette does this or not, is that they do not see the image as compensatory, but rather as fundamental to the articulation of a materialist relation to um, thought and practice. And I think that you can see this sort of non-compensatory philosophy of the image. You can find that in Lucretius. It takes a different form, but you can wrest it from Lucretius, and you can maybe see it in Diderot too, in different ways. I think when he gets to the question of like how femininity is lived in relation to that, in relation to the image, he takes a different tack maybe. But I think it's this question of like, is the image compensatory? Is it a supplement or not? For these women, it is not. It is not a compensation, and it is not a supplemental form. It is a necessary one, and it's a vital one.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, maybe I could follow up on that just with, and I mean, I totally agree, and I would argue that Lafayette might be similar in that respect. In 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 the section on Châtelet, you quote Châtelet as saying we need to keep the illusions we have. We can seek not to destroy them. We can choose not to go behind the set, to see the wheels that make flight and the other machines of theatrical productions, such as the artifice that we can use, and that artifice is neither useless nor unproductive. It's on page 133. This passage was really, really interesting, and but it also made me think of Diderot, and it made me think of Coisus et Colere, when Diderot is imagining Fragonard's painting, and he has this nightmare and gets through Plato's cave and stuff like that, and he's talking about the chains, and he's talking about the people who are watching the images. Are strapped down to their chairs, and they're not looking behind themselves to see the projection of these images up on the screen. So there, for Diderot, that kind of that scene of the theatrical production, that scene of the you should not go behind the set and see the wheels that make flight, is for Diderot this thing to try to avoid. We must turn our heads if we're going to see the kind of oppression, and if we're going to see the kind of the way in which illusion is being used to kind of subjugate us in different ways. And I think what's so fascinating is you're seeing Châtelet using precisely a very, very similar language to preserve herself, and I think the other women that you're writing about here, exactly from the kind of subjugation that Diderot is also kind of fighting a different they're both fighting a form of despotism, but they're doing it in the opposite way. And so I don't know if you have anything to say about
Oh
that.
no, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I Diderot is such a I he is himself, I think, quite ambivalent. And I have a somewhat ambivalent relation to his own ambivalence. And Rousseau could be, I could say the same thing about Rousseau in it, but it's a different kind of guise, in a sense. But um I think this question of sort of the looking behind, right? Like there, in a way, there is no behind. There's only through for these for the authors, the three authors that I'm writing about. But also, I think that you can see, there are 17th century moments like Saint-Evremont and his papillotage, which is very, certain respects, like degraded aesthetic position, right? Where you're both within the illusion and you're outside of it at the same time. And it is that kind of flickering, that kind of oscillation that generates the sort of heightened aesthetic pleasure. I think that these three women are making use of that sense of at once being projected in and necessarily being cast out, right? Like you can't you preserve your illusions, but in the consciousness that that is what you're doing, um, rather than being, fully immersed within them or captured by them or captivated by them, in a kind of durable way. And I see Diderot as like quite ambivalent about that. about the flickering or the oscillation. Sometimes he embraces it. He makes use of it really brilliantly and technically incredibly sophisticated ways. Like La Religieuse is an example of that, I think. But at the same time, he's hesitant about it as a scene for philosophy, I think. But you might
If I
disagree.
might just interrupt really quickly, I
Sorry.
would just say actually that Diderot actually flips Plato there, right? Because for him, the pleasures of Fragonard, the whole fiction of the dream that he's telling D'Alembert, is precisely to say that fiction is the way in which we lose our kind of submission to the power that illusion has over us, right? By actually showing us how the sausage
Right.
is made.
Right.
And just really quickly, if I might kind of jump in there, I think this also, I really appreciate, Natania, how you kind of deal with the variety and the pleasures of pleasure, right? I mean, just in its complexity. And I'm thinking from our own positionality looking back, it seems to me that you're actually reorienting in a very profound way the classical question of causality within metaphysics to the pressures of generation and biology, the generative of the feminine. And I wonder to what extent we might be re-articulating how we might actually rewrite a history of metaphysics from the perspective not of physics but of biology. I mean, in some ways, how we might kind of think about threads of scholasticism, etc., not specifically even through the the um, the line of pleasurable thought or Epicurean thought, but even through the lens of kind of biology as a basis for metaphysics.
Oh, thank you so much, Hector, for it's an amazing question. I feel like I couldn't presume to rewrite the history of metaphysics in any way, but like I appreciate that the book kind of invites that idea. I guess I don't know if this is a response to what you're actually saying, so correct me. But I feel like this is not a book about life life as a kind of either as a scientific object or as an object of literary preoccupation. And I've gotten more interested in the way in which life and a kind of biopolitical relation to life takes over some of the possibilities and some of the coming back to what Jessie was saying about mechanism, right? Some of the more like seemingly mechanistic or seemingly artificial dimensions of 18th century thought, and particularly this sort of the link between femininity and artifice, that all of these people are kind of studying in different ways. So I'm a little hesitant around biology for that reason. I think we could have a really interesting conversation around sort of the role of maybe natural philosophy. Of all the three people I write about, I would say Du Châtelet is perhaps closest. Right, she's a scientist in a way that Gaffini and Puisier are definitely not scientists. And so but I feel like the object of her science is not life as such, if that makes sense.
So it's a
Yeah,
purely literary encounter.
it's not purely literary, but science, but her practice of science, I would say she eventually kind of folds in her practice of science to the pursuit of pleasure and to the projection. I think Andrew was talking about this, to the projection of a future, and the projection of a different kind of reception of her work. But she's Leibnizian. She's being reclaimed and reworked now, as a scientist, as a philosopher, and to a certain extent as a literary person as well. But for a long time, her science was sort of written out of the history of philosophy, precisely. And here, I'll come back around to your question, Hector. Like precisely because it didn't fit within this larger history of metaphysics. It didn't seem to read properly in that vein. So.
Well, and it's also such, I mean, the question of life or sort of vitalism or generation, or in Lucretian terms, like Venus genetrix, Venus as generator, mother of all things. I think that you're getting at something so important here, Tanya, which is that we're both, it seems like with the figures you're talking about, and I also think in Lucretius, we're both talking about sort of bodies producing in ways that seem biological in Lucretius' poem, but we are also thinking about like literary production, the production of illusion, the production of feelings that are material, but somehow also get a little away from it. We're talking about images. And so vitalism, as it has been construed over the centuries, can limit that pretty substantially. I really like, I don't know, I like Claire Colebrook's work on sort of the varieties of vitalism and vitalisms that aren't just bodies that I find really helpful. And I think that your mentions of Deleuze, in the book, which are sort of fleeting, is an interesting pointer towards like what sort of vitalisms or anti-vitalisms or non-vitalisms might be helpful, which is to say ones that include a virtual or a poetic or all of these things. I do have a question. I have a different question. Is that okay?
Can I say
We do
something
have,
really
Yeah,
quickly in relation to what you just said?
yeah,
Sorry. Is that okay? I'll go very fast.
yeah,
yes,
yeah. No,
absolutely, absolutely.
Like in regard to the question of generation and reproduction, I was really influenced by Luce Delier's article on transsexual Lucretius, which is really fascinating and like sees Lucretian nature as actually emerging within castrate or within a kind of cut. So reads Lucretius as a trans philosopher and like reads against that kind of, insistent distillation of Lucretian nature to a scene of fertility. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because
Yeah.
that's an important reference for me. Go
Well,
ahead.
and I
Sorry.
think it's so important because it's funny because that's like something I've been personally like working my way towards. Like when we talk about voluptas, when we talk about Venus, when we talk about genetrix, we're not really in a lot of the reception, in Lucretius himself, we're not really talking about women. We're talking about maybe something that's usually called femininity, and you're very careful to talk about like receptivity or softness or communicability. And that's not the same as women or even necessarily femininity. And moreover, in the reception of Lucretius, you look at 15th century into 16th century Italy, and Lucretius is thought of as being uh, not just effeminate or not only effeminate, but as being about homosexual, as like errant sexuality of all kinds, like a non-normative, and in that sense, non-generative. Like you say at one point in your introduction, if we think of Epicurus as the castrated philosopher, he doesn't leave a legacy, which gets to just really complicated, weird, sticky stuff going on around gender. And I think you're so right to point towards like not a gender binarism, right? And not a gender binarism or sort of a fixed gendering or like movement between gender as an important aspect of what we're talking about might be the way of putting it.
For sure. At the same time as I see like the kind of gender fluid aspects of some of the 18th century naturalists is not necessarily um, uh, feminist or queer.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Ultimately.
Totally. Totally.
Yeah,
Okay, the actual
sorry.
question. I'm so sorry. So I really appreciate your discussion of the image as compensatory or not, right? And I think that this is, of course, one of the big sort of moves in Lucretius or the reception of Lucretius is, hey, Plato, sorry, images are not these sort of degraded copies that are only ever compensatory. The image, the object are both real, both material, both sort of active in the encounter. And oh God, I have like multiple different versions of this question. Okay, I guess this will get me to one of my questions. So the way that this shows up in a lot of early modern poetry is in poems of mourning, right? Where the image is left over after a period of war, because in 16th century France with the wars of religion, in 17th century England with the English civil wars, and I'm thinking particularly of somebody like Lucy Hutchinson, whose elegies for her dead husband are just absolutely shot through with these sort of memory image stuff that's very Lucretian, while also being very Platonic. So this is my transition to a question of in early modernity, the sort of constraint context, or at least in 16th century France and 17th century England, what I work on, the constraint context of like where we have to find pleasures in this condition of constraint is usually war, right? And that's one of the reasons why Lucretius is such a potent interlocutor, because his framing is in the midst of the Roman, civil unrest, and Venus becomes a way of dealing with it, because it's like, hey, Venus, can you seduce Mars with your honey words? So the question would be, are there kind of particular contexts in addition to in conversation with gender that are finding like fertile ground in Lucretius or materialism more broadly? Sorry, that was long.
Oh, no, no, that was great.
Natania,
And
can I,
sorry, am I?
no, can I just interrupt and ask maybe if we could collect a few questions from the audience and see, since I think there are some people and we're running out of time, and then maybe you could respond to a few questions.
Absolutely.
Mahmoud,
Thank you.
Mahmoud, you had your hand up.
Neetu. Can you hear me well, Natania?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. My internet is a bit shaky, so forgive me if I will be cut. I can repeat also the question again. Congratulations, and it's good to see you and many of you. I have a couple of quick questions about the element of illusive with materialism, this kind of combining them together. I'm wondering if this is in some way, or I'm wondering what you think of it in relation, or how we think of it in affinity with neo materialism and affect theory. Like, are you like trying to differentiate what you are doing from these two way of thinking, or these two theories, or these two models? And I'm wondering what you think of that, because there is something in the illusive itself that's ungraspable, that it cannot be fully located in the material, right? And also it's active because it's ongoing, escaping you, right? So I'm wondering what you think of that. And the other question in my head also, and I cannot help but to think of in this family resemblance way between pleasure and desire from this Deleuzian position, because desire for Deleuze is, and like I'm asking the question from our mutual love for his work. So like his desire for him is productive. It's a place of starting something, doing something, moving in the world. But for me, I'm not sure, is pleasure like the end line? Like, is there something comes after pleasure? Is this a goal? Is this like a place of like absolute equilibrium, or what? Like, I'm wondering, and how we can put it comparatively in conversation with the concept of desire as a protective force from this like Spinozian way of thinking. Thank you, and congratulations again.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Should I answer the question? Is that okay?
I think so, and I'll just encourage others to drop questions in the chat. But yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Those are all great questions, and thank you so much, Mahmoud, for both of those questions, and Jessie too for the question about war. I'll try to answer them all at once. I think the relation to affect theory, that would be something I'd have to think more about. But my initial sort of reaction to your kind of positing of the ungraspable is that I feel like, yes, this is to a certain extent about the ungraspable, but it's an ungraspable that emerges not from within, but from without, if that makes sense. So that might be a distinction from affect theory. It's not an interior emergence, but instead it's something that comes maybe in a rather early modern way, like comes from outside. So that's my answer there. And then the question of equilibrium, I think, yes, pleasure is an end, pleasure is a goal, but that goal is never sustainable. I mean, one of the interesting things about pleasure is that it is itself necessarily ephemeral. It constantly has to be kind of redeployed and reactivated. So that sort of ending is never is never sufficient, and is never self-sufficient. And Jessie, I was really interested in what you were kind of in your raising the question of war. It made me want to think more about the way in which sort of erotic relations and war are articulated with one another in texts of this period, so that I wouldn't go so far. These are all aristocratic women whom I'm writing about. Like, I'm not suggesting that they are somehow, in situations of utter destitution. But they are nonetheless, I think, concerned. They're not optimistic. The portrait of the Enlightenment that emerges from them is not an optimistic portrait, but is instead concerned with the question of the ruined life, which for them often emerges out of love, out of affective dimensions, but affective dimensions that are like highly constraining and highly like significant in terms of how they may live their lives. Sorry, I'm trying to go fast, but also answer.
It's just
I don't know.
so
Yeah.
interesting because the question of is Lucretius, is De Rerum Natura optimistic or pessimistic has
Right.
actually been such a huge one in like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
reception onwards. Is this a depressing poem or is it a really lovely positive poem? And people are just not on the same page.
Right. I think it's both. Ultimately, that's a cop-out answer, but yeah. That's my cop-out answer for the moment.
Natania, maybe you could
Yes.
talk, and maybe this follows up a little bit on Mahmoud's some of Mahmoud's question, but the the difference for you between pleasure and volupté, because they're different at different moments in the book. There's emphasis on different ones. In the Puisieux section in particular, the pleasure is kind of seems to be dismissed to some extent because it's so elusive, it's so impermanent, and volupté comes as this kind of reflected pleasure, an intellectualized pleasure that has a capacity to be more reciprocal and to be um, more stable in a certain way. In the Châtelet chapter, volupté kind of disappears. It's mentioned a little bit in the beginning, but then it kind of disappears, and pleasure really becomes the significant mode by which you kind of read and understand what Châtelet is doing in her kind of materialist interventions. And so I'm wondering how you think about the kind of movement between those two different terms. Why are why is one featured at certain moments and the other at other moments?
Thank you so much for that. That's a really insightful question. And I think the Puisieux in the context of her kind of examination of volupté and plaisir, she's also playing with the gendered nouns, right? So it's an allegorical tale, which kind of lends itself to a reflection on the way in which language, in particular, sort of structures enjoyment. So I think she has fun in a way with volupté versus plaisir in that context. But at the same time, I think volupté, there's a significant sort of corpus of libertine texts. The vast majority, if not the entirety of them, being authored by men or masculine identified people. And I think it is dangerous for her. She has a moment where she says, okay, I could write more about this, but I won't, because I don't want to acknowledge that I know anything about this. I think volupté in particular, its affiliation with a kind of libertine and Epicurean legacy is dangerous to kind of claim and lay claim to. So Puisieux has this kind of unique, almost unique opportunity in her short story. I would say that neither Du Châtelet nor Graffigny touch the concept in the same way. But even within Puisieux, there's a hesitation precisely around that concept. And the allegorization, I think, makes it easier to handle in some senses. So it is a kind of a unique moment in that way. I haven't answered your question very effectively, but
No, that's great.
I do think there's something exceptional going on in that short story, I guess is the answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I think we're a little over time, but it was just such a fabulous conversation that I couldn't I couldn't end it. But Natania, I hope you see all of the wonderful messages in the
Oh,
chat
gosh.
about how wonderful the book is and how wonderful the conversation is. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you so much, Jessie. It was so wonderful listening to you all talking, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Neetu, and
So
thank you all. And also, I saw some people I really want to like hugely thank in the audience, and just it means so much to me that you're here. Anyway, and that all of you did, took the time and did the work to be here. I really appreciate it so much.
everyone needs to go out and read the book. It's really,
Okay.
really fabulous.
Thank you for writing this book.
Okay.